Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys. Hello and welcome to episode 12 of Podcasts of the Caribbean. We are still covering At World's End today. This is the third part in At World's End episodes. If you haven't listened to episode 10 and episode 11, go back and listen to those ones so you're caught up with At World's End. If you want to go listen to the Curse of the Black Pearl and the Dead Man's Chest episodes, you can go listen from episodes 1 to 9, and they cover those two movies. So we have a lot of really exciting stuff to cover in this part of At World's End today. It's going to be a very exciting episode. A lot of crazy stuff is going to go down, so I can't wait to start getting into it. So let's not waste any time. Let's do it right now. Let's get into it. So we ended last week's episode right after Jack Sparrow saw the dead Kraken on the island, and we had that great chat with him and Barbossa. And they see that Sao Fang's ship, the Empress, has made its way over to the Black Pearl, and Sao Fang's crew, Tai Huang and his men, who were serving under Jack, they have revolted, and they're now, of course, obeying their real captain, Sao Fang, and they take Jack Sparrow, Barbossa, and the rest of the island party captive, and we're starting right off with them being brought back aboard the Black Pearl. So we have all the Singapore pirates, they're just cheering as the rest of the shore party is brought on board, and I love how Jack very cautiously steps up the ladder onto the Black Pearl because he doesn't want to see Sao Fang. So Barbossa steps over to Sao Fang, who is, of course, standing on the deck of the Black Pearl, and he says, "Sao Fang, you showing up here is truly a remarkable coincidence." And then I love how Jack just runs and hides behind Barbossa. And then I love how Sao Fang walks right past Barbossa, and he's like, "Jack Sparrow." And I love how Jack pops out and smiles at him. And then Sao Fang's like, "You paid me great insult once." And Jack's like, "That doesn't sound like me." And Sao Fang just knocks him right in the nose, breaking his nose. And I love how Jack just snaps it back, and he's like, "Shall we just call it square then?" I love that moment. It's so great. It really shows, very, very briefly, it really shows the history between Sao Fang and Jack Sparrow. Of course, we don't see it in these movies, but there are some comics and different secondhand materials that do show their relationship. And Sao Fang obviously does not like Jack Sparrow. So after this happens, Will pushes through the crowd, and he demands Sao Fang to release Elizabeth. He says, "Release her. She's not part of the bargain." And Barbossa is perplexed, and he's like, "And what bargain be that?" And I love how Jack is still holding his nose in this scene. It's amazing. But after Barbossa says that, Sao Fang is like, "You heard Captain Turner. Release her." And then I love how Jack just is shocked, and he's like, "Captain Turner?" And then Gibbs is like, "Aye, the perfidious Rotter led a mutiny against us." And Will says, "I need the pearl to free my father. It's the only reason I came on this voyage." And after Elizabeth is freed, she runs over to him, and she's like, "Why didn't you tell me you were planning this?" And then Will says, "It's my burden to bear." So, of course, we had that great chat in the last episode, Will and Elizabeth talking about, Jack and the Kraken, and Elizabeth saying that Will didn't need to know because it was her burden to bear. And I love how Will is like, "Okay, but how am I supposed to trust you if I don't know what you're doing?" And then we turn around, and Will has been planning this whole scheme from the beginning, and he didn't tell Elizabeth. Like, come on, man. You're kind of contradicting your own philosophy there, but Elizabeth is pissed with Will right now, as usual in this movie. And so Jack takes this moment, and he's like, he needs the pearl. Captain Turner needs the pearl. Or he points to Elizabeth, and he's like, and you felt guilty. And then he points to Barbossa, he's like, and you and your brother in court. And then he gestures to everyone, he's like, did no one come to save me just because they missed me? And I love how everyone just looks at each other and no one says anything. Even Gibbs just looks at Tiadama. And I love how Marty's the only one to raise his hand right off the bat. And then you can see Pintel and Rigetti also raise their hands very nervously. And he like points to him and smiles. Even Jack the Monkey raises his hand. And then I love how Jack points at them. He's like, I'm standing over there with him. And then right before Jack is able to walk over there, Xiao Feng grabs Jack by the shoulder and he's like, I'm sorry, Jack, but there is an old friend who wants to see you first. And then Jack's like, I'm not sure I can survive any more visits from old friends. And Xiao Feng pulls Jack over to the side of the pearl and he says, here's your chance to find out. And then I love how you can see Jack's face just drops to like him being absolutely scared. Because what do we see in the distance? The Endeavour. Cutler Beckett's flagship. So, of course, Jack knows the Endeavour. He can spot it right off the bat. And this is pretty crazily, it's also one of my favorite scenes in this movie and one of my favorite scenes in the whole franchise. Because these two characters, Jack Sparrow and Cutler Beckett, have a very, very storied past. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on between them. There is a very, very excellent book. It's called The Price of Freedom. It came out in 2011, and it pretty much, the whole book deals with Jack becoming a pirate. So it's Jack as a young adult. And I'll definitely cover this book in full on a future episode, but I'll give a brief summary as to what happens in that book and kind of the start of Jack and Beckett's relationship. So Jack as a young adult, I should also mention there's a whole other book series of the Young Jack Sparrow books. There's like 12 main books, and there's a spin-off about Bootstrap Bill. And that's Jack as a kid, kind of like a 10, 12-year-old kid. But this Price of Freedom book takes place after. And this is Jack as a young adult working under the East India Trading Company. There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in between that, from him going to a pirate to being in the company, and that's a story for another time. But the main point I'm trying to say here is Jack, of course, was working under Beckett, and very summarized, I'll say, Beckett wanted Jack to trade slaves. And if you know Pirates of the Caribbean, it's also a deleted scene for this scene we're coming up to where Jack has that famous line. I'll cover that in just a second. But Jack refused to trade these slaves. As he'll say, as I'll mention in the deleted scene, he says people aren't cargo. And Jack's refusal of trading these slaves is what branded Jack Sparrow as a pirate. And we see it in the deleted scene as well with the P on his wrist. And the book is absolutely incredible. It deals with the Black Pearl before it was the Black Pearl, when it was called the Wicked Wench. And that was the ship Jack was using. And after he revolted and after he was branded a pirate, this is also mentioned in the deleted scene as well, which is where a lot of this basis comes from for when the book was created 4 years later. Cutler Beckett took the Wicked Wench, which was Jack's ship and what Jack cared about the most, and he sat Jack down and he held him down and made Jack watch as he set fire to the Wicked Wench and literally sunk the ship in burning flames and made Jack Sparrow watch. And it's very crazy, and this whole thing leads to Jack Sparrow making a deal with Davy Jones to bring the Wicked Wench back up for 13 years with him being captain. And since it was burned and sunk, the ship was now charred black, and that is therefore how it got the name, the Black Pearl. So that's a very brief history on Jack and Beckett, and I think their relationship is absolutely fantastic, and this being the only scene in the movies that we see the two of them interact, I wish we had more interaction between them. There's a lot more of this scene that they cut out. It's the extended scene, and you can see it, and I'll cover it later. And I wish that was in the movie only because these characters share such a past that I wish we had that whole scene to really flesh out their relationship. Because Jack knows Beckett really well, and Beckett knows Jack really well. And they're kind of like old friends, but they also hate each other. But that's enough of that. I'll get to The Price of Freedom in a later episode where we record it very much in full. But Jack is taken aboard the Endeavor, and he's brought into Beckett's chambers, and he's left there. And in the movie, we have this version, and there's also a deleted scene version where Beckett says a complete different dialogue here. But in the movie, Beckett begins and he says, "Your friends appear to be quite desperate, Jack. Perhaps they no longer believe that a gathering of squabbling pirates can defeat the Flying Dutchman. And so despair leads to betrayal. But you and I are no strangers to betrayal, are we?" And I love how as Beckett is saying that, Jack walks up to a bunch of different containers and starts opening them up, looking for something. And of course, when Beckett says the line, "But you and I are no strangers to betrayal, are we?" and the camera focuses on the P, the branded P on Jack's wrist, it also alludes to what I was saying. There is, of course, the deleted scene that has become very infamous here, where Beckett says a complete different dialogue, and Jack then says one of the most iconic lines that's not in the movie. And I'll just bring this part up now, because this is the part that I feel like everyone talks about. They don't talk about the rest of the extended version of the scene. And I'll talk about the rest of it in the deleted scene episode that I'll do. But in the deleted scene version, Beckett says this. So Jack is brought into his chambers, and Beckett begins with saying, "Remarkable. The last I saw of that ship, she was on fire, a blackened hulk sinking beneath the waves. We had a deal, Jack. I contracted you to deliver cargo on my behalf. You chose to liberate it." And then the camera flashes to Jack's wrist, and it shows the P, and Jack then replies, "People aren't cargo, mate." And then Beckett says, "And you incurred a heavy debt to raise her up again, didn't you?" And that's that part. That's what I'll cover here. We'll talk about the rest of it later. But that's, of course, the complete different dialogue in the deleted scene, which shows Beckett talking about him destroying the Wicked Wench, therefore bringing it back as the Black Pearl, talking about the slave trading and people on cargo. That has pretty much become one of the most infamous moments in this franchise, and it's not even in the movie. And I feel like I'm pretty sure the reason they said that they took that out, especially the people on cargo line, was because it made Jack a little too, Jack's whole character is he's supposed to be mysterious, and you're not really supposed to know what side he's really on. And I believe what they said was that they didn't want the scene in the movie because it made Jack's character a little too, I don't know what the right word is, but they made him it felt like it made him seem a little, I guess, I don't know, like a good person. I don't know, it's a very weird, like he had a good moral compass or something. And they wanted Jack to kind of stay as a character playing all the sides. Which is, I somewhat get, but also it's such an important line for this whole franchise and for Jack Sparrow's character that dialogue should have been in the movie instead of what we have now. I think it gives so much with, the Black Pearl history, the people on cargo, all of that. I think it adds so much instead of what we have in the movie when Beckett's like, "Yeah, and despair leads to betrayal, but we're no strangers to betrayal, are we?" It still kind of gives that same effect with, him being branded a pirate, but you don't get that history. So I wish they had the deleted scene version in the movie. I think it would have been very, very cool, but let's move on with the rest of the scene because I'm rambling too long about Jack and Beckett here. But of course, when Beckett was saying that, Jack was looking through different containers, and Beckett then says, "It's not here, Jack." And then Jack turns around and he's trying to play coy. He's like, "What? What isn't?" But of course, Beckett knows Jack was looking for the heart of Davy Jones. And he says, "The heart of Davy Jones. It's safely aboard the Dutchman, and so unavailable for use as leverage in your service to your debt to the good captain." And I also love how Beckett says all this, but Jack's like, "Oh, cool, now I know where the heart is." And that drives the rest of Jack's arc to get aboard the Flying Dutchman in this movie. And Jack says, "By my reckoning, that account has been settled." And then Beckett says, "By your death." And that stops Jack in his tracks. And then Beckett replies, "And yet here you are." And I love how Jack picks up Beckett's staff and looks at Beckett's portrait. And he's like, "Close your eyes and pretend it's all a bad dream. That's how I get by." And I love how he tries to reenact the pose in the portrait. And then Beckett says, "And if Davy Jones were to learn of your survival?" And then Jack kind of ponders this for a second. And I love their dynamic, because Jack doesn't like Beckett. We know this. And Jack is a bit afraid of Beckett, but when they're both in the same room, they both have the same level of intelligence because they're both so crafty and hard to understand that they both it's so good. They both know each other so well that they both stand in the same room and they kind of act like equals, They're kind of both on the same playing field. Jack's so used to taking advantage of people that don't know what's going on, but Beckett knows Jack so well. He knows how Jack is, and Beckett or Jack kind of takes away that kind of frilly nonsense that he has a lot of the times, and kind of just speaks plainly with Beckett. And I really like that. I really like their dynamic in that scene. And it's something that's not really talked about a lot. But with these characters that share such a history, I love that is how they communicate. And that's how that scene plays out. But we take a quick break from that. And we have this great shot of the Empress on the left of the screen, the Black Pearl in the middle, and the Endeavor on the right. And we see a few boats of Beckett's men going over to the Black Pearl. So, of course, now, if the Empress taking the Black Pearl and its crew prisoner wasn't enough, now the Endeavor and the East India Trading Company have showed up to take prisoner as well. And the East India Trading Company is aboard the Black Pearl as well. And this all goes back to the deal that Sao Feng, Will, and Ian Mercer made at the very beginning of the movie in Singapore. So Mercer meets up with Sao Feng on the Pearl here, and Sao Feng says, "My men are crew enough." And then Mercer replies and he says, "Company ship, company crew." And Will shows up and he's like, "You agreed. The Black Pearl was to be mine." And then Sao Feng smiles at him and he's like, "So it was." And then he orders Tai Huang to punch Will in the gut, and then he's taken prisoner. So Will has been betrayed out of their deal. And then we go back over to Jack and Beckett on the Endeavor, and Beckett fills up a few glasses of alcohol, and he says perhaps he'll consider an alternative arrangement, one that requires absolutely nothing from you, but information. And I love how before Jack takes the cup offered to him by Beckett, he looks down and sees the 9 coins on the desk. And Jack knows that Beckett's getting close, and he might as well try to play the con and try to get some more information from Beckett and try to switch up sides here. So Jack develops his plan in his head, and he takes the glass from Beckett, and he says, "Regarding the brother in court, no doubt." in exchange for fair compensation. And I love how he grabs the second cup from Beckett's hands, and then he drinks the first one, and he's like, "Square my debt with Jones." And then he takes the second one, and he's like, "Guarantee my freedom." And then Beckett's like, "Of course, it's just good business." Of course, the first uttering of that iconic line. And Jack picks up the little Beckett figurine, and he's like, "And were I in a divulgatory mood, what then might I divulge?" And then Beckett gets close to Jack, and he's like, "Everything. Where are they meeting? Who are the pirate lords? What is the purpose of the 9 pieces of 8? And then we go back over to the Black Pearl, and Will and Elizabeth are both shackled once again. And then I love how Sao Feng puts his hand on Mercer, and he's like, "Beckett agreed. The Black Pearl was to be mine." And then Mercer says, "He's not going to give up the only ship that can outrun the Dutchman, is he?" And then Mercer, I love how Mercer just looks down at Sao Feng's hand, and Sao Feng just takes his hand off. And now Sao Feng has been betrayed out of the deal, and you should have known if you made a deal with the East India Trading Company, they were going to bite you back. So Sao Feng and Will have both been betrayed out of the deal with Mercer. Should have known better, especially when you're making a deal with the East India Trading Company. But Sao Feng is angry, and I love how we see Barbossa on the side, and he walks towards Sao Feng. He's like, "Shame they're not bound to honor the code of the brethren, isn't it? Because honor's a hard thing to come by nowadays." And then Sao Feng says, "There is no honor to remain with the losing side. But leaving it for the winning side, that's just good business." And then I love how Barbossa's like, "Losing side, you say?" I love his face when he says that. And Sao Feng's like, "They have the Dutchman. Now the Pearl. What do the brethren have?" And then Barbossa says, "We have Calypso." And I love how we get that Calypso music playing in the background. And I love how Sao Feng looks over at Elizabeth. And this also kind of brings back earlier in the movie when they were in Singapore, and Sao Feng was talking to Elizabeth. You have that Calypso. You have the Calypso theme playing in the background as well, which was kind of alluding toward this scene where Sao Feng thinks that Elizabeth is Calypso. And I find it so funny how he instantly looks at Elizabeth because she's a woman, but he completely just does not think about Tiadama, who is also the only other woman on the ship. Like, it could be either of them, but I like how he just immediately shifts to Elizabeth and like, she's Calypso, definitely. But Sao Feng looks back at Barbossa and he laughs. He's like, "Calypso, an old legend." And I love how Barbossa looks behind him to see what Sao Feng was looking at, and he sees Elizabeth. He's like, "Oh, he's looking at Elizabeth." So Barbossa then makes this plan. And then Barbossa says, "No, the goddess herself, bound in human form. Imagine all the power of the seas brought to bear against our enemy. I intend to release her, but for that I need the Brethren Court." And I love how you can also see Tiadama in this shot as well, and you can kind of see the smug look on her face, because she is Calypso. And hearing Barbossa wants to set her free definitely gets her a little intrigued, because of course she wants to be free. But yeah, Barbossa says, "But for that I need the Brethren Court." And then he picks up Sao Feng's jade necklace, and he says, "All the court." And of course that also shows that Sao Feng's jade necklace is his piece of 8. And then we go back over to the Endeavor with Jack and Beckett again, and I love this part of the scene. Jack turns around with a fan, and I love how he's fanning himself, and he's like, "You can keep Barbossa. The belligerent homunculus and his friend with the wooden eye both." I love how he says that, referring to Pintail and Ragetti, of course. I love that description. And then he's like, "And Turner, especially Turner. The rest go with me on the Pearl, and I'll lead you to Shipwreck Cove, while I'll hand you the pirates, and you will not hand me to Jones. Bloody fair deal, don't you think?" And then Beckett then asks, And what becomes of Miss Swan? And Jack ceases his fanning, and he's like, what interest is she to you? And then Beckett just smiles. And I'm still trying to figure out, I don't know if I'm dumb for not knowing what this means, but I'm still trying to figure out what he's referring to with Elizabeth. I guess he would I don't know. I guess he would probably want to kill her because he killed her father, and then killing the last Swan would kind of end the line of the Swan reign on Port Royal, therefore making him solely in charge. Maybe that's what he was referring to, but I'm still clueless as to what he really means by that line. Maybe I'm just stupid, but I don't know. We go back over to the Black Pearl, and I love how Sao Fang is dead set on Calypso being Elizabeth at this point. And he's like, what are you proposing, Captain? And then Barbossa's like, what be accepted, Captain? And then I love how Sao Fang is like, the girl? And I love how Elizabeth is immediately like, what? And then I love how Will just looks over and he's like completely shocked. And then we go, and this starts this very, very cool scene where we go back and forth from the Endeavor to the Black Pearl. And it's a very, very cool scene because we get a very quick scene on the Endeavor, and we go right back to the Black Pearl, then we go right over the Endeavor again. I really, really like it. But we go back over to the Endeavor, and Beckett's like, Jack, I just remembered. I've got this wonderful compass, which points to whatever I want. And then I love how Beckett grabs Jack's compass, and he's like, so for what do I need you? And then we go back over to the Pearl. I love how Will is like, Elizabeth is not part of any bargain. And then Barbossa's like, out of the question. And then Sao Fang's like, was not the question. And we go right back over to the Endeavor, and Jack's like, it points to the thing you want most, and that is not the brother in court, then is it? And then Beckett's like, then what is, Jack? And then I love how Jack just states it plainly. He's like, me. Dead. And then we go back over to the Pearl, and I love how Elizabeth immediately just says, done. And then Will's like, what? And he looks at her, and he's like, not done. And then I love how Elizabeth looks at him and like, you got us into this mess. If this is what frees us, I'm done. Then we go back over to the Endeavor. I love how we just get that shot of Beckett saying, damn. And then he just throws the compass over to Jack, and Jack throws the fan over to Beckett. And then Beckett pulls out the fan and starts fanning himself. And he's like, although, if I kill you, then I can use the compass to find Shipwreck Cove, is it, on my own. Then he pulls out a pistol and aims it at Jack as he walks toward him. And he says, cut out the middleman, as it were. Then we go back over to the Pearl, and Will is like pleading with Elizabeth, like, Elizabeth, they're pirates. And then Elizabeth's like, I have had more than enough experience dealing with pirates. And then Barbossa asks, then we have an accord. And then he looks at Sao Fang, and they smile at each other. Then we go back over to the Interceptor. We go back over to the Endeavor again, and Jack's like, with me killed, you've arrived at the cove, find its stronghold nigh impregnable, and able to withstand blockade for years. And then he'd be wishing, oh, if only there was someone I had not killed inside to make the pirates then come outside. And then Beckett's like, and you can accomplish all this. And then Jack just says, you may kill me, but you may never insult me. Who am I? And I love how Beckett's like, he just like shakes his head. And I love how Jack is like, I'm Captain Jack Sparrow. And the whole Endeavor is rocked. And Beckett and all of his figurines fall down. I love how Jack grabs Beckett's hand. He's like, done. And he shakes it and runs away. And he opens the doors, slams the doors on the two soldiers outside, knocks them out. And then we can see that the Black Pearl is now letting loose the guns on the Endeavor. They're firing on the Endeavor. They're as they're trying to get away. We also see the Empress is literally out of here already, sailing away with Elizabeth in tow because Sao Fang thinks that she is Calypso. And I love how Jack emerges on the deck as all of this chaos is going down. And I love how everyone's just running around, but Jack just calmly walks up the stairs. And Beckett walks out, and he sees the Empress sailing away in the distance. And then we go over to the Black Pearl, where we see Ian Mercer and Barbossa fighting. Barbossa does get the best of Mercer, and Mercer just jumps off the ship to get away. And I love how we see Jack's psycho plan when he's got a cannon and he's got this rope draped on the back of it. And Beckett witnesses this, and he sees this whole thing. And Beckett looks inside the cannon and he sees the little Beckett figurine. And we see Jack blowing on the stick, and Beckett's just like, "You're mad." And then Jack's like, "Thank goodness for that. If I wasn't, this would probably never work." And then he lights the cannon on fire. The cannonball shoots out, hits the mast. Make sure you notice that it hits the mast on the side. And the rope on the back flings off, and it shoots Jack into the sky, and he screams as he literally crosses from the Endeavor to the Black Pearl in midair. And I love how the whole crew looks at him just flailing in the air. And they run over to the stern of the ship. And they see the rope slip off the deck. But then Barbossa looks up on the back of the ship, and you see Jack standing up there, leaning on the lamp, and he's like, "And that was without even a single drop of rum." And I love how Barbossa just has this, and he just sheathes his sword and walks away. And then Jack gets down, and he walks over to Will, who is still shackled, and Jack just says, "Send this pestilent, traitorous, cow-hearted, yeasty codpiece to the brig." And we go over to the Endeavor with Beckett and Groves, and Groves says, "Which ship do we follow?" And then Beckett says, "Signal the Dutchman to track down Sao Feng. We follow the Pearl." And then I like how Beckett's like, how soon can we have the ship ready for pursuit? And then in the background, you can see the mast that Jack hit with the cannonball starts creaking, and the whole mast falls over. And that was Jack's plan from the very beginning, to disable the Endeavor. And Groves is... once again, Groves is admiring Jack Sparrow. Of course, in the first movie, he had the iconic line, "It's got to be the best pirate I've ever seen." And then once again, Groves is admiring Jack, and he's like, "Do you think he plans it all out, or just makes it up as he goes along?" And I love how Beckett just looks at him, and then Groves just runs away. And then we have a great swell of music as the Black Pearl sails away in an absolutely gorgeous shot. And the movie fades to black, and it fades in again on the Empress. So now we're going over to the Empress with Sao Feng and Elizabeth. So we go over to the captain's quarters of the Empress, and we can see that two of Sao Feng's servants are getting Elizabeth ready in this kind of ceremonial outfit or whatever. Very gorgeous outfit, by the way. Very, very gorgeous Chinese outfit with the headpiece and the robes, and then kind of the jacket, the sleeveless green jacket as well. And I really like the red robes that she's wearing. We see her with only that on later in the movie, just a little bit later actually. But I really just like her with just that robe on, and I really like the beautiful detailing on the robe. And it's a little easier to see when that green jacket isn't on. But very, very beautiful costuming. I should once again, actually, I don't think I've ever brought her up. I think I have not even brought her up once, which is absolutely terrible. But the costume designer on all three of these movies, I believe all 5 movies she was on, is Penny Rose. She is the absolute best costuming person to exist. I mean, the costumes she creates in these movies, absolutely outstanding. And I can't believe I haven't brought her up yet. I feel so sad that I haven't brought her up. I feel so bad because she is absolutely incredible. And you know, this outfit is one of many that she geniusly created and thought up. So shout out to Penny Rose. We'll bring her up again. I'm not gonna forget about her again, but shout out to Penny Rose. Absolutely fantastic costume designer. But you can see Sao Feng walks into the room as his servants kind of bow and walk away, and Elizabeth turns around and sees him. And Sao Feng is speaking in Chinese here. And he walks over to Elizabeth, and he claps his hands, and his servants exit the room, leaving only Elizabeth and Sao Feng. And I love how Sao Feng kind of has this little leaf, and he stirs it in that liquid. And it's like, by this time tomorrow, we will arrive at Shipwreck Cove, and you will be free, Calypso. And I love how he says Calypso, and Elizabeth's like, excuse me? And then he's like, not the name you fancy, I imagine, out of the many that you have, but it is what we call you. And then Elizabeth actually has no clue what he's talking about, but Sao Feng believes it as her playing coy, and she's like, we being who? And then Sao Feng turns around, and Elizabeth kind of does this like little gesture to make it sound like she's just trying to test him. And Sao Feng's like, you confirm it. And I love that he just eats that leaf. And Elizabeth is like, confirm what? You've told me nothing. And then Sao Feng says, the Brethren Court, not I. The first Brethren Court, whose decision I would have opposed. They bound you to human form, so the rule of the seas would belong to man, and not to me. Elizabeth butts in with that last line there. And Sao Feng says, but one such as you should never be anything less than what you are. And then Elizabeth says, pretty speech from a captain, but words whispered through prison bars lose their charm. And then Sao Feng says, can I be blamed for my efforts? All men are drawn to the sea, perilous though it may be. And Elizabeth then says, and some men offer desire as justification for their crimes. Sao Feng says, I offer simply my desire. And in return, Elizabeth says, I would have your gifts, Sao Feng then says, should you choose to give them. And then Elizabeth asks, and should I choose not? And this is where we get a little weird, and Sao Feng says, then I will take your fury. And he presses his lips to Elizabeth and literally pins her against that mast there and starts kissing her, which is a little weird, Sao Feng. Kind of a little strange. You're kind of just pressing yourself onto this woman who's most definitely younger than you. But this is also one of the first instances we see of someone kissing Elizabeth and then paying the price. We see this 3 times in this movie. And every time someone kisses Elizabeth in this movie, they pay the price. And Elizabeth finally pulls Sao Feng off, and he kind of gets pushed aside. And Elizabeth is honestly scared, and literally I would be too if I was in her position. And she's trying to back away. And as Sao Feng tries to walk closer to her, boom! Big cannonball comes right through the side of the Empress and blows Sao Feng away. And guess who's here? The Flying Dutchman is here, as Beckett said it would. And the Flying Dutchman is now attacking the Empress. And this is one of my very favorite little moments here that happens in just a second. We see on deck of the Empress, the Dutchman crew fighting the Singapore pirates. And I love how this is the first chance that we see Maury, the electric eel, or I guess just the eel, Dutchman crew member, who is literally one of my favorite Dutchman crew members only because it's an eel. Like, it's the human kind of body, but the head is completely erased with an actual eel that can grow larger or kind of tuck in smaller. And I love how Maury just absolutely just sticks its face onto that pirate and just literally gobbles his face off. Honestly, horrifying. But yeah, very, very cool there as well. And then we go back down to the cabin with Elizabeth and Xiao Fang. And as I was saying, this is one of my favorite little moments in this franchise. Because this is one of the biggest pieces of Elizabeth's arc in these three movies. This is like one of the most iconic moments for her arc. And, you know, she just whispers, Xiao Fang? And then we see Xiao Fang laying down against the wall, and we see this giant piece of wood stuck in him. So he's obviously dying. Which also leads me to my point of I feel like I'm sad that we didn't get more of Xiao Fang, because I really like Xiao Fang as a character. But we do have some other materials that he appears in, so that's cool. But Chow Yun-fat, absolutely fantastic as Xiao Fang, and he's just such a good actor that I wish we got a bit more of him in this movie. But he tells Elizabeth to come closer. He's like, here, please. And Elizabeth ducks under another cannonball that hits the Empress. And Xiao Fang grabs the jade necklace and pulls it off his neck, and he offers it to Elizabeth. And he says, with all 9 pieces of 8, you will be free. And he says, take it. And then Elizabeth finally grabs it, and then Xiao Fang says, you are captain now. And then Elizabeth's like, me? And then he grabs her hand and pulls her closer, and he's like, go in my place to Shipwreck Cove. And then I love how we see Tai Huang running down, and he's clutching his arm in pain, and and he runs down, and he's like, Captain, the ship is taken, we cannot. And then he sees Elizabeth and Xiao Fang, and then Xiao Fang just pulls Elizabeth close, and he says, forgive me, Calypso. And then his head falls back, and Xiao Fang goes limp, and Xiao Fang has died. And I love how we see Tai Huang, and Tai Huang pulls his hat off and drops it to the ground. And I love how Elizabeth is, you know, she's like, Sao? And she like, but then she notices that he's gone. And I just love what happens next. She looks at the necklace in her hands, and she stands up, and Tai Huang's like, what did he tell you? And then Elizabeth stands up and looking at the necklace, and she looks at Tai Huang, and she says the immortal words, he made me captain. And I love this moment for so many reasons, because it's one of the biggest pieces of Elizabeth's arc, of her going from where she was in Pirates 1 at the very beginning to where she ends up at the end of Outworld's End. And her becoming a pirate that happened, you know, in Dead Man's Chest, and that was a big piece. But the biggest pieces of her arc happen in Outworld's End, and this is that first part with her becoming a pirate captain, and not even a pirate captain, a pirate lord. So Elizabeth is now the pirate lord of Singapore. And then we go out to the deck of the Empress, and we see James Norrington one more time. Or not one more time. We see him a few more times, but we haven't seen Norrington since the beginning of this movie. And that's the one thing I don't like about Outworld's End, is that we had so much Norrington in Dead Man's Chest that we literally get like 2 minutes of Norrington in Outworld's End, which I'm so sad about, because I love Norrington so much. But Elizabeth and Tai Huang are pulled out of the captain's quarters, and they are held with swords to their neck. And Tai Huang just says to Elizabeth, "You are not my captain." But James sees Elizabeth, and he's like, "Elizabeth," and then she sees James, and she's like, "James," and she runs over to him. And this is such a sweet moment. He goes over and hugs her, and I love it so much. And he's like, "Thank God you're alive." And then he says, "Your father will be overjoyed to know you're safe." And then Elizabeth just tells him, "My father's dead." And then Narnton's like, "No, that can't be true. He returned to England." And then Elizabeth just says, "Did Lord Beckett tell you that?" And then we have this great moment of Narnton's face. And he just he thinks about that. But then we see Davy Jones is on the Empress as well. And he says, "Who among you do you name as Captain?" And then I love how Tai Huang says, "Captain, her," and he points to Elizabeth. And after he points, the rest of the crew points at Elizabeth as well. I love that. But you can tell that the crew of the Empress, they don't respect Elizabeth. But there's one act that'll get them to respect her, and it happens in just a second here. But Davy Jones looks at Elizabeth. He's like, "Captain." And then Norrington says, "Tow the ship. Put the prisoners in the brig. The captain shall have my quarters." Also, kind of showing a bit of favoritism, by the way, Norrington. A little weird. But Elizabeth just says, "Thank you, sir. But I prefer to remain with my crew." And then she goes over to walk to the rest of the crew, but Norrington stops her and he says, "Elizabeth, I swear, I did not know." And then Elizabeth just says, "Know what? Which side you chose?" And she shrugs off Norrington's arm and stands over with the rest of the crew of the Empress. And then she just says, "Well, now you do." And it's this moment with her siding with the rest of the crew and going to stay with them. You can see it in Tai Huang's face when Tai Huang looks at Elizabeth. You can kind of see a bit of a smile on his face. And that is the act that gets the crew to respect Elizabeth as their captain. Very, very awesome. And now we get to another great scene. So we get this great shot of the Flying Dutchman towing the Empress. And then we go over to the brig of the Flying Dutchman. And the rest of the crew is shoved in the brig. And Elizabeth runs over to the bars and says, "Bootstrap?" And then the guy outside happens to be the bosun. He looks at her and he starts laughing. And so Elizabeth, since she's aboard the Dutchman, she's trying to find Will's father. But of course she has no clue what he looks like. So she's just asking random people. So the bosun just laughs and walks away. And then she says, "Bootstrap." And then I love how she was asking Kalenico. And he's like, "Huh?" And Elizabeth's like, "Bill Turner." And then Kalenico just doesn't answer and just keeps swabbing the deck. But then we hear, "Bootstrap." And Elizabeth turns around. And then we see, in the very same cell that Elizabeth and the rest of the crew of the Empress are in, she sees Bootstrap Bill in that cell as well. And now I'll bring this back. If you remember, in Dead Man's Chest, after the Kraken brings down the Edinburgh Trader, Davy Jones says, "You need time alone with your thoughts. Brig!" And then Davy Jones throws Bootstrap Bill in the brig. So this whole time between Dead Man's Chest, that happening in Dead Man's Chest, and Our World's End now, Bootstrap Bill has been in the brig. He has not been anywhere else. He's been in the brig this whole time. And we can see that him being in the brig is not doing so well for Bootstrap himself. Bootstrap now has pretty much almost become part of the ship. And we can see he's kind of ending up like Wyvern in Dead Man's Chest. And he's kind of, literally becoming a part of the hull of the Dutchman. Because he's been in here for so long. So I love how that tracks, and he's been in here that whole time ever since the Kraken scene in Dead Man's Chest. But he says, "Bootstrap, you know my name." And then Elizabeth walks over to him, And I love how she kind of semi hides behind that wood pillar. And then she just says, "Yes, I know your son." And then Bootstrap is kind of confused. And then Elizabeth says, "Will Turner." And you can see that Bootstrap is forgetting. He's starting to forget because he's becoming part of the ship. And we'll see that in just a second later on in the scene, which makes it absolutely heartbreaking. But once she says Will Turner, he remembers. And he's like, "William." And then Elizabeth nods yes. And then Bootstrap gets all happy. He's like, "Ha ha!" And he pulls himself out of the hull of the ship and stands up. He's like, "He made it. He's alive. And now he sends you to tell me he's coming to get me. Ha ha! God swoon! He's on his way." And then Elizabeth is like, "Yes, Will is alive. And he wants to help you." And then Bootstrap looks at Elizabeth and his face drops. And he's like, "He won't save me. He won't come." And then Elizabeth is like, "But you're his father." And then Bootstrap pulls his finger and points it at Elizabeth. And he's like, "I know you. He spoke of you." And I love how when he says he spoke of you, you can also see the faint little smile on Elizabeth's face when he says that. But he says, "He can't save me. He can't come because of you." And then Elizabeth is like, "Me?" And then Bootstrap says, "You're Elizabeth." And then Elizabeth's like, Yes, I'm Elizabeth." Then Bootstrap tells her, "If Jones be slain, he who slays him must take his place. Captain, forever. The Dutchman must always have a captain. And if he saves me, he loses you." And I love how he says that, and you can see Elizabeth's expression, and she kind of just very silently nods yes, and she's like, "I see." And then Bootstrap, this is so heartbreaking, Bootstrap just says, "He won't pick me. I wouldn't pick me." Then he goes back over to rejoin the Hall of the Dutchman, and he just says, "Tell him not to come. Tell him to stay away. Tell him it's too late. I'm already part of the ship and the crew." Then Elizabeth walks back over to him and touches his leg, and she's like, "Bootstrap." And then he wakes back up, and then he starts again, and he says, "You know my name. You know my name." And this is so heartbreaking because it's so real, and it, of course, with being a part of the crew and the part of the ship, they start to lose their memories. But it also mirrors older people with like Alzheimer's and stuff. I've seen a lot of people say that, and it's so heartbreaking to see Bootstrap completely forget that whole conversation happening. It's so heartbreaking. But after he says that again, he's like, "You know my name." And Keira Knightley delivers this next line so well. You can hear her voice crack and her voice break, and she's like, "Yes, I know your son." And you can just hear her voice break when she says that line. It's so well delivered. But then Bootstrap thinks on it. He's like, "William, he's coming for me. Wait and see. You'll see. He promised." And then we just see one last shot of Elizabeth looking absolutely just completely saddened for Will's father. Then we go over to the next scene. And I just think that scene is so well done. It mirrors so many things, with older people with Alzheimer's. It's a very great allegory for that. And just the fact that Elizabeth has now finally met Will's father, and she now knows the rest of the burden that Will is bearing. And how Will is trying to balance Elizabeth and his father at the same time and trying to save both of them. And Elizabeth has finally met him, so now she's starting to piece together like, why Will is doing what he's doing. We go over to the next scene, and we just have a shot of a bunch of seagulls flying around a barrel that has a dead corpse strapped to it. Then the Endeavor picks up this barrel out of the ocean, and Beckett finds a bottle strapped onto this dead guy's wrist. So he grabs the bottle and smashes it open and pulls out the little cloth in there, and he sees it's just the East India Trading Company logo. And then Beckett kind of squints his eyes, and then his lieutenant is like, "Sir." And then Beckett goes over to the side, and he sees a bunch other of these barrels with corpses, and all the seagulls kind of marking them out. And Beckett says, "A breadcrumb trail, and we're meant to follow." And then his lieutenant is like, "A betrayer among them, or trap?" And then Beckett says, "A gambit by a skilled opponent. Change course, Lieutenant." And then the lieutenant's like, "Sir?" And then Beckett just says, "We can only hope to reach our destination before they run out of bodies." And then we go over to who is doing this, but it's actually Will Turner. Will Turner has devised this whole plan by himself. He's escaped the brig, and now he is tying dead East India Trading Company soldier corpses onto barrels to lead Beckett over to Shipwreck Cove mostly, but Jack has something else in store for Will. So as Will is about to cut this next barrel loose, he cuts it loose and looks at the knife, and it's Bootstrap's knife. And he then hears Jack, and Jack says, "You escaped the brig even quicker than I expected." I love how Jack is just sitting on the jib of the ship, just kind of just like relaxing there. Like, how long has he been there? And then Jack gets up and he's like, "William, do you notice anything? Or rather, did you notice something that is not there to be noticed?" And then Will is like, "You haven't raised an alarm." And then Jack's like, "Odd, isn't it? Not as odd as this. Come up with this all by your lonesome, did you?" And then I love how Will says, "I said to myself, think like Jack." Like, I love how Jack is like, "And this was what you arrived at? Lead Beckett to Shipwreck Cove so as to gain his trust? Accomplish your own ends? It's like you don't know me at all, mate." I love how Will is just defeated. And then Jack just says, "And how does your dearly beloved feel about this plan?" And then Will looks away, and Jack's like, "Ah, you've not seen fit to trust her with it." And then Jack jumps down next to Will, and then Will just says, "I'm losing her, Jack. Every step I make for my father is a step away from Elizabeth." And then Jack just says, "Mate, if you choose to lock her heart away, you'll lose her for certain. If I might lend a machete to your intellectual thicket, avoid the choice altogether. Change the facts. Let someone else dispatch Jones." And then Will is like, "Who?" And then I love how Jack is like kind of looking over at Will, and then Will looks over, he's like, "You?" And then I love how Jack just says, "Death has a curious way of reshuffling one's priorities. I slip aboard the Dutchman, find the heart, stab the beating thing. Your father goes free from his debt. You're free to be with your charming murderess." And then Will just says, "And you're willing to cut out your heart and bind yourself to the Dutchman. Forever." And then Jack's like, "No, mate. I'm free forever. Free to sail the edges of the map. Free from death itself." And then Will just says, "You have to do the job though, Jack. You have to ferry souls to the next world, or end up just like Jones." And I love how Will does that kind of mimicking of Davy Jones's tentacles. And then Jack's like, "Ugh, I don't have the face for tentacles." Then he's like, "But a mortal has to count for something, eh?" And then he goes down and he offers Will his compass. And Will takes it. He's like, "What's this for?" And then Jack just says, "Think like me. It'll come to you." And then Jack gets up close and breathes on Will. His breath is so bad that Will just falls back and falls off the pearl into the water. And Jack pushes off that barrel that Will cut free, and pushes it into the water, and Jack just says, "My regards to Davy Jones." And then Will gets onto that barrel and he just says, "I hate him." And then we go back over to the Flying Dutchman, where we have a great scene, and this will be the last scene we cover on this episode. So someone unlocks the door to the brig, and we see Elizabeth and the rest of the crew of the Empress standing in there, and we see that who has unlocked it? It's none other than James Norrington. And then he tells them to come with him, and no one moves, not even Elizabeth moves. And then Norrington just says, "Quickly!" And I love how no one moves, but Tai Huang looks at Elizabeth, then Elizabeth nods to Tai Huang, and Tai Huang then gives the orders for the rest of the men to move. It's just like she earned their respect so quickly, and like Tai Huang now follows her as their captain. Like, he was waiting for her order to move. Like, I just love how her siding with the crew gained their respect so quick. It's so absolutely fantastic. I love it so much. But everyone gets out of the brig, and then Elizabeth just goes over to Norrington. She's like, "What are you doing?" And then James just says, "Choosing a side." And then we go over to this great shot of the Flying Dutchman and then the Empress behind it in tow, and we can see that Norrington is having the crew go over to the Empress via the rope that's towing the ship. And so they're all they're coming out of the side and moving along the side of the Dutchman here. And I love how Tai Huang is helping Norrington get everyone on the ropes. Very cool moment there. But you can see Bootstrap noticed that everyone was gone. So he gets up and then he notices that the door to the brig was unlocked. So he sees this, and then he goes out to find where everyone went. So you can see Norrington and Tai Huang are helping everyone get on the ropes. Tai Huang finally gets on himself. Then Elizabeth comes down over to James, and James just says this line here, and James says, "Do not go to Shipwreck Cove. Peckett knows of the meeting of the brethren. I fear there may be a traitor among them." And then Elizabeth just says, "It's too late to earn my forgiveness." And then I love this line from James Norrington. It's one of my favorite lines from him. And he says, "I had nothing to do with your father's death, but that does not absolve me of my other sins." And then Elizabeth just says the words, "Come with us." And then James looks at her and he's like, "James, please come with me." And could you imagine the alternate reality where James Norrington goes with Elizabeth and becomes a pirate? Could you imagine the alternate reality that we could have had with James Norrington becoming a pirate? I mean, how cool would that be? Seriously, how cool would that be? But of course, that's not meant to be. Because after Elizabeth says this, we hear Bootstrap from above says, "Who goes there?" And Norrington puts Elizabeth behind him, and he draws his sword. And notice the sword that he has. It's, of course, the sword that he got when he was promoted to Commodore in the first movie, and he still has it. Keep in mind, it's about to change owners in just a second. James just says to Elizabeth, "Go, I will follow." And then Elizabeth looks at him, and she says, "You're lying." And James looks at her, and he says, "Our destinies have been entwined, Elizabeth, but never joined." And then he, knowing this is probably going to be the last time he ever sees Elizabeth, he kisses her, finally. That's, we have this character, James Norrington, he loved Elizabeth so much. And, he wanted to marry Elizabeth. He loved her so much. But when he noticed that she didn't love him in return, and she instead picked Will over him, James, he still loved her, and he respected her choice. And he, even after, not being in love with her, he still loved her and protected her in Dead Man's Chest. And we have that great kind of, platonic friendship in Dead Man's Chest between them, which I really, really love. And this guy's whole arc through his movies have been, realizing that he loved Elizabeth the whole time, but since she didn't love him back, he just did all he could to protect her. And I absolutely love that, and that's why I love James Norrington so much. When I was a kid, I despised Norrington because I always thought that he was a guy in the way of Will Turner, and I was always like, oh, no one likes Norrington, he sucks, Will Turner's the better option. That's what I thought when I was a kid. But growing up, you really realize that James Norrington is such a well-developed character, and he's honestly grown to be one of my favorite characters in the whole Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, just because of how well he's developed in his actual story in these movies. And so he kisses Elizabeth here, which is all he ever wanted, man. That's all he ever wanted. And after he kisses her, he just tells her to go. He says, "Go now." Then Elizabeth finally makes her way on the ropes and starts getting off the Dutchman right as Bootstrap Bill appears with a wooden stake in his hands. So Norrington points his sword at Bootstrap and he says, "Back to your station, sailor." And then Bootstrap just says, "No one leaves the ship." And then Norrington just says, "Stand down. That's an order." And then Bootstrap says, "That's an order. Part of the crew, part of the ship. Part of the crew, part of the ship. Part of the crew." And I love how he starts chanting that, and James is like, "Steady, man." And then Bootstrap yells, "Part of the crew, part of the ship. All hands, prisoner escape." And then Norrington pulls out his pistol and says, "Belay that." And you can see how Elizabeth turns around and she screams, "James!" And he turns around and looks at her. And he makes the decision. Of course, he knows at this point that there's no way he's going to be going with Elizabeth, but he will go out saving her and protecting her one last time. So what he does is he pulls out his pistol and shoots the lines connecting the Empress and the Dutchman, and the lines completely just fall into the water. Everyone on them falls into the water, but that was the last time that Norrington would protect Elizabeth. He would save her life one last time, and right after he does that, he turns around and Bootstrap impales him with that wooden stake. And it's absolutely terrible. You just see Elizabeth flailing in the water, just screaming James's name, as we see the silhouette of his body just falling to the deck of the Dutchman. And it's such a well done scene. When I was a kid, I didn't really care because I didn't like Norrington, but like now that I like him so much, it pains me to see him die because of how well of a character he was and like everything. But that was the end of his arc, and I would have loved to see him go with Elizabeth in an alternate reality and become a pirate, and that would have been so cool. But Norrington's arc in these movies was to protect Elizabeth and realizing that she loved someone else. But even though she loved someone else and not him, he was still going to protect her with everything he had. And he goes out one last time and protects her and sacrifices himself to save her one last time, just like her father died as well. So as I said earlier, in episode 10, both Governor Swan and James Norrington go out and sacrifice themselves to save Elizabeth. So Norrington's body drops to the deck, and we see the rest of the crew comes out and sees Norrington's body, and Clanker is like, "The Admiral's dead? Admiral's dead." And then Davy Jones appears as well, and after seeing Davy Jones, Macus signals to everyone else, "To the captain's cabin!" And then everyone says, "Aye," and they all follow Macus to the cabin, leaving just Bootstrap and Davy Jones. And Davy Jones kneels down to James Norrington, and he says, James Norrington, do you fear death? And what does Norrington do? Norrington stabs Davy Jones with his sword. Kind of giving that last hell no to Davy Jones right before Norrington breathes his last breath and goes limp on the Dutchman. And I love that, how he stabs Davy Jones, because, of course Davy Jones was going to offer him, do you fear death? How about you serve on the Dutchman? But Norrington was like, hell no, and he stabbed Davy Jones instead, and Davy Jones just says, I take that as a no. And then now we see he stabbed him with a sword. Davy Jones pulls out this sword, and he says, nice sword, and he walks away with it. So now the Sword of Destiny has changed owners from James Norrington to Davy Jones. And then we just see one last shot of James Norrington's dead corpse. And then we go over to the deck of the Flying Dutchman, where the Flying Dutchman crew are revolting against the East India Trading Company soldiers, and they're kind of taking them captive. And Davy Jones walks over to the captain's cabin, and then he joins Macus, Klenico, and Penrod, and a bunch of other crew members in there, and he just sees the rest of the East India Trading Company soldiers are positioned in the captain's cabin, and we see Murtaugh Mulroy pointing both cannons at the dead man's chest. And then Ian Mercer walks on screen, and he says, the Dutchman, and he's holding the key to the chest, is under my command. And then Davy Jones just says, for now. And then he turns and walks away, and that is the end of that scene, and that is a great place to end this episode. So we are now an hour and a half into the movie, but it's a perfect place to end this episode. We're already at 75 minutes, so I think it's a great place to end. In the next episode, we're going to be getting right into the Brethren Court, Shipwreck Island, Shipwreck Cove. A lot of really, really cool stuff is going to happen in the next episode. But this is where we'll end this one. So I thank you for listening if you've gotten all the way through this episode. I hope you've enjoyed the At World's End episodes so far. I've been noticing that a lot of people are actually really enjoying them so far, which I am very happy with, because it is my favorite Pirates movie. So thank you for enjoying them if you have been listening. If you listened last week, I mentioned that the podcast is now on a bunch more platforms that you can listen on. So if you're listening on one of those platforms, feel free to give a rating or a review on whatever platform you're listening on, because that'll, of course, boost the podcast up in the searches so more people can easily find this podcast. So thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next week for the next chapter of At World's End. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email or question, send it over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. You can also follow this podcast on Twitter at podcastpotc and over on Instagram at Podcast of the Caribbean. I post some fun content, some trivia over on there. Make sure to go give those platforms a follow. And be sure to keep a weather eye on the horizon. And always remember, dead men tell no tales.